Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar, Preparing for the 2024 Threat Landscape. This event, brought to you by Security Magazine, is sponsored by AlertMedia. And now, I'm excited to turn things over to today's presenters. Katie Gowen will introduce them to you now.
Thank you so much, Rochelle, and hello, everyone. I'm Katie Gowen, Director of Communications at AlertMedia. I'll be one of your moderators today. And I hope you all had a wonderful new year and are ready to hit the ground running in 2024, because as you all know, in the security space, a new year typically means a new threat landscape to assess and prepare for. So with that in mind, today we're going to talk about the top threats security professionals can expect in 2024. But first, I would love to introduce you to today's speakers. First, we have Sara Pratley. Sara is the Senior Vice President of Global Intelligence at AlertMedia, where she leads a team of analysts responsible for monitoring and alerting on emerging threats and incidents worldwide. Prior to AlertMedia, Sara was the Vice President of National News at CNN in their domestic news gathering unit. She led the network's coverage of just a ton of major events, things like the Boston Marathon bombings, Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, several destructive natural disasters, and many, many more. So we are definitely in great hands today. Welcome, Sara. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Katie. Glad to be here today.
Wonderful. We also have a special guest joining us today to help out with explaining some of our severe weather threats, and that is Jason Moreland, Senior Meteorologist at AlertMedia. Jason received his Bachelor of Science in Meteorology from the University of South Alabama. His professional experience within the private sector includes more than a decade of extensive domestic, international, and offshore forecasting. And throughout his career, he has provided really critical decision-making support to just a wide range of businesses, event venues, and even sensitive utility projects. So hi, Jason. Thanks for being here today.
Hey, thank you so much, Katie. Glad to be here.
Yes, well, thank you again, both of you, for taking the time today. And I do want to just quickly review our agenda before we dive in. First, we're going to take a look back at the 2023 threat landscape, which helps us to inform the landscape for 2024. Then we will spend the bulk of our time on those top threats that you should be looking out for in 2024. And then finally, we're going to review some best practices and, just general tips for monitoring and communicating threats. And then we'll take some questions from you. So as Rochelle said, you can submit those questions in the Q&A box at any time. So now I'd like to launch our first poll for the day. And I do recommend that you participate in the polls throughout the presentation, just because that will help guide our discussion and also just give us an idea of kind of the needs and concerns that you guys have. So the question that we have for you right now is, how would you rate your organization's emergency preparedness and response efforts in 2023? Would you say they were excellent, good, adequate, needs improvement, or poor? So let me just give that another few seconds for you guys to get your answers in. And then I am going to go ahead and share these results with everybody. Okay, so if everyone can see that, about 43% of folks said that their preparedness and response efforts last year were good. But as you can see, all of the answers are represented here. So we do have a kind of broad spectrum of folks here on the call today. So Sara, is that surprising to you at all, or is that about what you expected to see?
I think broad spectrum for sure. Definitely some people more prepared than others, which is okay. It means there's areas for opportunity. And even for people who do have, obviously, good preparedness, right? There's always room for growth. So hopefully we can help there too.
Jason, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I'm just glad to see some honest answers. I think everyone has at least a little bit of room for improvement in this category. And I think that's what we're all here for today. So hopefully we can be of assistance.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off by passing things over to Sara. She's going to quickly review the crisis events we experienced in 2023, which will, as I said, give us a better understanding of how we can prepare for 2024. So Sara, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. So as in most years, there were a number of major events, threats, disasters that really impacted businesses, employees, and really just communities across the globe. For the year 2023, we definitely saw an increase in billion-dollar disasters. I know Jason's going to go into that a little bit more. But there were also a number of major transportation disasters globally, some really significant ones. We had the train derailment and chemical spill earlier in the year in East Palestine, Ohio, in the United States. Of course, the collapse of I-95 in Philadelphia, but then there were also a number of devastating train crashes, two in particular that we've highlighted here, one in India and one in Greece, both killing hundreds of people. Mass shootings always across the year, especially in the US. I know we had the one in Lewiston, Maine, still kind of fresh in our memories with the manhunt towards the end of the year. Labor strikes, demonstrations, riots, a lot of activity just continuing to percolate again across the globe throughout the year. And then all of that happening amidst an ongoing war in Ukraine, as well as a new war happening between Israel and Hamas. So really, with all of these events and more, we keep seeing that the cost, the frequency, and the severity of the threats that our teams are tracking and just paying attention to really continue to be on the rise. Jason, I mentioned a few things, but I also mentioned that you would kind of take over from a weather perspective. So when you think about 2023 and looking back, can you just walk through maybe some of the significant events that folks should keep in mind as we talk about the year ahead?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Sarah. I would say that, first off, across North America, what we saw this past spring and summer was a pretty uneven wildfire season. I think in the years prior to that, we got used to seeing much of the Western U.S. having the bulk of the problems, but by far it was Canada that had the lion's share of problems, really from coast to coast, from Nova Scotia all the way out towards British Columbia. It was a pretty unprecedented state of affairs for much of Canada when it comes to those wildfires, around 6,500 from coast to coast. And as a result of that, there were over 200,000 people that had to evacuate due to rapidly spreading fires during the summer and even into the fall months. Even as we got into late October, there was still quite a bit of fire activity. Roughly 5% of Canada's forest has burned all within just the past 12 months. So again, these are just some really unprecedented numbers. And then, of course, we had the disaster everyone is familiar with out across Hawaii, with approximately 100 fatalities in Maui. And they're still recovering from that. There's still a lot of debris that's being picked up even to this day from that incident due to an ongoing drought and high winds and electrical downed wire line caused some of that fire activity. And then given the weather conditions, things took off quite rapidly. When it comes to Atlantic hurricane season activity, there were 20 named storms. Fortunately, there was only one major hurricane that hit the U.S. that was Idalia. It avoided much of the major metros, including Tampa. Otherwise, the cost of that landfall would have been exceptionally higher. And then I think in terms of overall North American tropical storm impacts, the biggest one that happened this year was Hurricane Otis. It was a nightmare scenario in which residents in Acapulco, Mexico, a population of roughly 1 million people, were expecting a tropical storm landfall about 24 hours prior to the storm moving inland. Instead, it defied all expectations, became a Category 5, and killed scores of people. And so that's the risk that we face in this day and age with record warm water temperatures. The environment is more primed for rapidly intensifying storms. And so these are things that we're going to be looking at as a year in review, but also looking forward to in 2024. I'll go ahead and expand upon this a little bit more into the next slide. We're talking about extreme heat. Of course, when it comes to climate change, there's really two notable trends that we've seen the most of in recent years. That's going to be an overall uptick in heat waves and also extreme flood events. 2023 was no exception when it comes to extreme heat. In fact, 65 million Americans were impacted by record heat at some point during the summer months. 2023 was also one of the top 10 warmest years on record for at least 35 states. And in June, much of Texas was dealing with an unprecedented heat wave with temperatures as high as 114 to 119. In Phoenix and across much of the Southwest U.S., they too also dealt with a record period of excessive heat, with heat wave conditions continuing across Phoenix for well over a month. There were 31 days in which the actual temperature was 110 or higher, 31 consecutive days. The prior record to this was 18 consecutive days set in 1974. This continued on into the Midwest in August, with Chicago getting its first heat index value ever recorded in excess of 120 degrees, which is quite impressive when you think about it that far north. And so these are just things that we're seeing across the U.S. But when we branch this out into more of a global perspective, it just was confirmed within the past couple of weeks that the average temperature globally was 1.46 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And this is the highest that we've seen the global temperature on modern record. So why is this happening? Well, it's because of a combination of El Nino, which is a naturally occurring phenomenon within the Pacific that does tend to increase the global temperature. But in the background, we also have this long-term trend of increasing global warming. So when you combine both of those factors together in 2023, that set the stage for a pretty prolific year. So that's just the heat aspect of what we saw in the past 12 months. When it comes to record-breaking floods, so think about it this way. When you have a warming atmosphere, overall the atmosphere can handle more precipitable water. Basically, the amount of moisture in the atmosphere increases with a warming planet. And as a result, when conditions are favorable for a heavy rainfall event, there is at least a greater frequency of record-breaking heavy rainfall and subsequent flash flooding. So we saw that, especially, I would say, during a 12-month period, 12-day period, I should say, in September. There were at least 10 different countries impacted by catastrophic floods almost simultaneously, resulting in tens of thousands of fatalities. And I would say that during that stretch, it was Storm Daniel that really was the main headline there. I know that we do have some interests that are viewing in places like Western Turkey, for example. But Storm Daniel really originated across the Eastern Mediterranean, where water temperatures were much warmer than average, resulting in a very heavy rainfall event. There were some areas in Greece that received over 40 inches of rain within a 24-hour period, breaking all prior records. At least 17 deaths were confirmed in Greece. Similar impacts that did extend all the way into Western Turkey. Then in the days following that event, the same storm system shifted southward into northern Libya. And this storm did have some tropical characteristics to it. And when you take a tropical system and move it into a desert-like climate as northern Libya, for example, that sets the stage for record rainfall and record flooding. Unfortunately, we saw 10 to an upwards of 20,000 deaths across northern Libya. And those are just some of the big headlines that happened out across Europe. Of course, across the U.S., we were not immune to similar impacts, with Hurricane Hillary producing significant rainfall and flooding in California, the atmospheric rivers that preceded it during the winter months, 1 in 100 year type flood events in Fort Lauderdale, New York City, the Great Vermont Flood of July. The list goes on and on. But we're definitely seeing these indications of a warming climate, and we're going to talk more about this in the later slides. But for now, Sara, back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. So there are definitely a few themes that we saw play out over 2023 that I thought would be important to really point out here. First off, global conflicts have a reverberating impact around the globe. We see this a lot, inciting demonstrations like we've seen in relation to the war between Israel and Hamas, impacts to the global food supply like we saw at the onset and since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and also an increase in hate crimes just related to a number of different incidences. And then we also continue to see an uptick in volume and severity of threats. Our team tracks this quite consistently over the course of years. Jason obviously talked about this a lot as it pertains to weather. Our global intelligence team unfortunately covers a variety of mass violence incidents that unfortunately, again, are continuing to be on the rise. And then the number of cybersecurity events isn't just going up, but associated costs. We're all seeing the numbers, they're skyrocketing. And business travel has increased significantly since the pandemic. This is probably a good thing. We're pretty much back to pre-pandemic levels. But what that does mean is we're in a position where there's a lot more exposure, right? We've got business travelers in addition to people who are working anywhere because of different technology and different, lifting of restrictions when we got into the pandemic. So just a lot to continue to think about there as well. And as we just saw, really today's threat landscape is marked by higher volume of critical events than ever, and also more uncertainty when it comes to all these events happening around the globe. So to adequately prepare your business for an emergency, you really need to first understand what you're up against, which is what we're here for today. So with that in mind, our team at AlertMedia, we interviewed a number of safety leaders, security experts, risk and intelligence analysts, meteorologists, of course, to really get a better understanding of what businesses should be considering as they conduct their 2024 planning, and really continue to look over the horizon and what they can do, of course, to ensure that employees are safe, and then they have great business continuity amidst this evolving threat landscape. So there were 5 main threats that really weighed heavily on our minds, and those that we talked to that we believe should be really at the forefront as you're going through preparedness, not only for this year, but also in the years to come. We obviously could expand this well far beyond beyond 5 threats and 5 areas. These are just the 5 that amongst all of our practitioners really continue to resonate in all of our conversations. So climate change being number 1. We'll spend a good bit of time on this threat in today's presentation because severe weather and natural disasters really impact every organization, no matter the size, no matter the industry, and certainly no matter the location. And of course, we have Jason's expertise here to lend to that. Cybersecurity incidents, as I mentioned earlier, ransomware attacks are increasing in cost and impact. So that's, of course, a big one to dive into. Activism, and civil unrest. We're seeing labor activism really increase globally. More than 450,000 U.S. workers went on strike in 2023 alone. There's a number of other factors in this category as well. Global turmoil. We're seeing current conflicts have significant local and global impacts, but also looking over the horizon at many other things that could potentially materialize. And then lastly, digital disruption. AI in particular has been a really big focus over the past year. And though there are many positives being yielded in this area, there's also a lot of warning signs that we should all be aware of. So let's go ahead and break these down one by one. I'll go ahead and hand it back to Jason so that we can dive into climate first.
Sure. Thank you so much. So yes, on the topic of climate change, due to the rising temperatures and due to climate change, severe weather is becoming more frequent and catastrophic. I think it's become pretty clear, even just within the last 2 weeks across the U.S., we're dealing with a cold snap. But on top of that, there's a lot of severe weather mixed in. And of course, we are going to see fluctuations both up and down in temperature. But overall, when you look at it on monthly and annual timescales, the globe is definitely seeing a rising trend as the years go on. And with weather being both a universal and a highly specific threat, depending on your business location, you can expect to face weather threats no matter, where your business operates. And preparation is going to be key to navigating severe weather safely and effectively. So that's what we're kind of here for. And again, in terms of the topic of extreme heat, which is something that we're seeing something increasingly more as the years go on, again, touching back with what happened in the past year with not only the climate change, but also naturally recurring phenomena such as El Nino. We've already just had the warmest year on record within the past 12 months, and it's becoming increasingly clear that extreme heat is something that needs to be taken seriously as it is a deadly threat. In fact, it's one of the number 1 causes of weather-related deaths, and this is also confirmed by the CDC, especially for people working outside or in areas without climate control. So, for example, if you have employees working within a warehouse or a manufacturing floor, those individuals are going to be at high risk during especially these prolonged heat wave events that can last for days and weeks. And it's also come out that the longer these heat waves persist, the overall medical risk tends to increase during the duration of these events. And then finally, when it comes to OSHA, they're aiming to curb some of these worker injuries and illness through their national emphasis program for heat safety, which is a sign that the danger of extreme heat is not going to really go away anytime soon. And, just to kind of foreshadow what may be ahead in the next 12 months, still dealing with El Nino, which could prime the pump for yet again another year of record warm temperatures, at least especially within the first 6 months here from January through at least May to June. Now, as we take more of a deep dive into some of the historical figures, this is a look at the cost and frequency of natural disasters. And this is on a global scale. So this isn't something that's just U.S. centric. You can see the U.S., though, experienced the highest number of billion-dollar disasters in the past 12 months. The final count at the end of the year, at least so far, it stands at 28. That's nearly triple the 30-year average. And you can see that this wasn't just a one-off event. You can see that this has been scaling upward for, much of the past, several decades here. The current cost of the disasters in the past 12 months is roughly $92 billion. And while that may not be quite as high as what was experienced in 2022, which was over $160 billion, the increasing frequency and severity is still attributable to climate change. And we're likely to see this number continue to trend upward in the years to come. Finally, I keep touching on this specific El Nino, but it's likely to continue well into the spring months. So we're likely to see a continuation of at least enhanced severe weather for at least the next, into the remaining months of winter into the start of spring across much of the globe, as we're already seeing. And then in terms of wildfires and air quality, we already touched on how much of a record-breaking year it was for interest in Hawaii and then especially Canada. But let's not forget what also happened across places that you don't even think about in terms of being in danger when it comes to wildfires like the Midwest and the Northeast U.S. You don't necessarily need to be close to a 10,000-acre wildfire for there to be significant impacts. So think about the scenes that we saw this past year in places like Milwaukee, Chicago, New York City, the list goes on and on, of dense wildfire smoke that was filtering from areas as far north and west as British Columbia, Canada at times. And so with this increasingly vulnerable climate that we're in when it comes to a greater frequency of droughts, excessive heat waves, along with that will come the risk of additional wildfires and worsening air quality. So these are all things that we should consider, not just for 2024, but really for the foreseeable future. We've already touched on, like I said, the situation in Hawaii and Canada. But again, this is likely just going to be a microcosm of more events similar to this in the years to come. Another big concern that I have is that we've seen, especially since around 2020 with the start of COVID, a lot of remote workers are now moving into areas that maybe they weren't quite as familiar with, moving more into rural populated areas where you're getting close to the wildland urban interface is what we call it. These are areas that are more prone to wildfire, and you're still seeing a lot of population growth within that zone. And so we're seeing not only an increase in fire activity, but also greater cases of people being involved in these zones that are usually at high risk during the summer months. So that's a little bit about heat and wildfires, but also on the topic of flooding, which I know sometimes it can be a bit confusing. It seems like we're talking about apples and oranges when it comes to climate change. On one hand, you're dealing with droughts. On the other, you're dealing with flooding. But these are two trends that we're likely to continue to see. And again, as climate change becomes more and more abundant, the atmosphere is going to be able to contain more and more water vapor. And so, for example, when you deal with a landfalling hurricane, especially if it's a slow-moving hurricane, we're going to see greater in the way of inland rainfall flooding from these tropical systems. It's not just a coastal event anymore. Never quite was just a coastal event, but even if you're in places like the Tennessee Valley or the Mid-Atlantic, we need to be paying close attention to these landfalling systems. So then when it comes to the topic of severe weather preparedness, looking ahead, what's the best way to approach some of these things? Well, the first thing I would do is conduct an assessment for your specific locations. Depending on where you are in the country or on the globe, your overall threat may look a whole lot different compared to an area somewhere else. So you really need to figure out what you're up against before the storm ever really appears on the radar. Do a risk assessment for your business location and any attributed locations where employees may be located, especially in this remote age environment. So again, start by knowing your risk. And then also you want to prepare for coinciding emergencies. We've seen plenty of these just within the past week. In the case of ice storms, you see things like power outages, water main breaks, boil water advisories that can last for days and weeks at a time. So a lot of times you can have cascading impacts well beyond the main storm. This could be something that lasts for days and weeks on end. We've also seen curfews after landfalling hurricanes and efforts to prevent looting. We've seen that in each of the last two hurricane seasons in Florida. So really the hurricane, the storm itself, that's really just the tip of the iceberg. And then when it comes to preparation, we can't really be thinking about things as just the company anymore, because when your employees are busy taking care of last minute preparations, making last minute changes to their own personal plans, that's also going to impact business continuity, right? So one of the big things that we always advocate is promoting individual employee awareness and preparedness, especially for these larger scale threats like natural disasters. They're going to affect more than one single business location. It's going to be impossible for any one person to have the best answer or best response plan for every single employee. So really arm them with some guidance tools, and then let them set the rest of the planning into motion on their own, especially when it comes to arranging things at their own, family, space, for example. And then also when it comes to redundancies, when a critical system fails or a primary safety leader is unavailable, you need to have a backup plan. When it comes to integrating redundancies in your weather preparedness efforts, such as having multiple backup generators and multiple people trained to conduct your response plans, those are just some of the things that we're really advocating. And then, of course, ensuring that you have deployed every communication channel to reach your employees with critical information, as these systems often will go down during periods of natural disasters. But again, that's just scraping the surface here when it comes to natural disasters, and Sara has a whole lot more when it comes to some of the remaining threats that we should be planning for.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. So let's go ahead and dive into our second focus here, which is cybersecurity. We can jump right in and take it right to the next slide. One of the areas where we've heard about cyber just over the past several months, but also over the past several years, is with the war in Ukraine. Cyber attacks, of course, being a major front in the war and really reverberating around the globe, especially with allies for Ukraine. Cyber attacks obviously will remain a huge focus as we continue to see the war effort play out. But as we transition more to a business focus, really good data here. More than a third of ransomware attacks in the US impact critical infrastructure, which is very concerning. Healthcare and public health seeing some of the highest numbers. And then in addition, high impact attacks on industrial operations. Those rose 140% from 2021 to 2022. It'll definitely be interesting to see as we get some more data from the FBI that should be coming out in March. So as you can see from this list, those some industries are more susceptible. Really no business is immune at this point from cybersecurity. Ransomware costs are also increasing. Nearly $450 million extorted just in the first half of last year. Experts anticipate it could be the second most expensive year on record, which isn't super surprising as we look at some of these statistics. DHS warning that the rate of attacks is likely to increase as hackers become more sophisticated. And then another important note is that risk extends beyond your organization, right? We use a lot of products, vendors, partners, and there's a lot of exposure there. I'm sure everybody remembers the breach of password security system LastPass. That impacted over 100,000 organizations last year, 33 million individual users. I know I myself was using it. It also included not just one, but two attacks that resulted in the loss of company IP. So a lot to really consider there. And once again, it's really important to keep in mind that attacks on your business are not just one consideration that you should have. Obviously, being aware of cybersecurity concerns for all different products and the things that you and your business are intertwined with are really important. All right, let's talk about some ways to be proactive when we think about cybersecurity. There's so many, but just distilling a few here. So first, obviously training employees on cyber awareness and protocols for really reporting suspicious activity. It's table stakes. I know most organizations are doing it, hopefully doing it well. We talked to experts a lot about this second one too. Really important to understand what the priorities are if you have some sort of cyber attack. When you're restoring things, what are the priorities within your organization when it comes to system restoration? So understanding and aligning on that on the front end. An emergency communications tool, especially one that has multi-channel notifications, can be really handy and important so that you can make sure to get to your whole employee base with information. And then lastly, talk to your leadership team really to understand what your company's tolerance is when it comes to ransomware attacks. I think this is incredibly important. Every business has a different risk tolerance. If you understand when or whether your business is willing to pay ransom or not, that's really going to help you to understand the impacts and really get things in motion or be a part of that process if you're not necessarily somebody who oversees cyber. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our third threat outlined here, which is a focus on activism and civil unrest. So in 2023, our global intelligence team sent our customers more than 9,000 alerts about instances of medium or high severity demonstrations and civil unrest events around the globe. That is a huge increase from the year before. It's a 40+% increase. It was largely driven at the end of the year by pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian events that have been pretty consistently scheduled since the October 7th attack, but also important to note other geographical activity. Activism around climate issues, labor activism also drove these numbers to a really skyrocketing rate. So for 2024, we really expect widespread protests and civil unrest are going to continue to dominate headlines and really create operational risks around businesses, really around the entirety of the globe. So one of the things I hit on, labor, I obviously, this is definitely one I've mentioned a few times. We've seen a huge uptick, not just in the US, but globally. I mentioned this earlier, but I'll mention it again. It's a big number. Nearly 500,000 American workers participated in strikes in 2023. Some of that was focused, of course, around the TV and film industry, also the streaming industry, but also a lot amongst healthcare workers, auto workers. So a very large portion there. A few other important stats that I thought were good to pull out here. The number of unionized workers is also on the rise, with more than 200,000 added just in 2022 in the US. And then the latest numbers of 2023 are due out soon, so I'd expect to see that trend persist as well. And then public opinion. Again, this is focused on the United States, but public opinion here is at its highest since 1965. So experts saying that strikes, obviously are contagious. We're seeing some of these numbers increase. It could be due in part to that. But again, I just want to reinforce it definitely is more of a global phenomenon as well. We see this a lot in Europe. Besides labor movements, civil unrest related to concerns about foreign policy, legislation, economic instability, social issues, they're all on the rise. In just the first 3 weeks following the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas conflict, more than 4,200 protest events occurred. Tens of thousands of protesters. Those numbers are just continuing to go up. We're seeing this pretty much every weekend. We're on the cusp of yet another weekend with a call to action. Protests are really likely to ramp up even further throughout 2024 as the situation persists and as we're seeing. The U.S., of course, is also preparing for demonstrations and political protests around the 2024 presidential election. We've got months to go, but it's also, well underway as we've had the Iowa caucuses earlier this week. In fact, beyond the U.S. too, I think it's important to note it's a huge election year around the globe, more than 40 countries up for pretty consequential shifts in power. So a lot that we'll be focusing on there. Business continuity risks in these situations include everything from street closures to vandalism, traffic disruptions, transportation disruptions. So really a lot there to take into consideration. The reality is that some activism can be anticipated. That's a good thing, right? We can plan for it. Those protests surrounding the election cycle in particular, but seemingly random surges in activism often happen in response to a sudden or kinetic incidents as well. So predictable or not, civil unrest can really interrupt operations and put your people's safety at risk no matter where it is. So here are a few things to really keep in mind. First, communication. That's key, thoughtfully and intentionally, of course. Civil unrest and protesting often occurs around events that could be divisive. Clearly, people are emotional at these sorts of events. And again, you can know in advance of many of these events. So communicating with your employee base ahead of time is really going to be key, especially if you know something is going to happen. Next, really important, shore up your physical security at your facility. If your proximity to a protest puts your business at elevated risk, it's great to boost your security around the affected areas, even if it's temporary, right? You can also implement target hardening techniques and really work with your organization to become more prepared in that area. And then lastly, expect peace, but prepare for violence, right? These are being prepared for some of the things that hopefully don't happen. Again, most of the situations that we're looking at with protest demonstrations are generally business continuity issues, but it's important to prepare. What we continue to see time and time again in many instances, especially when there may be counter protesters, we may have different violence or different targeted issues that are happening. So to be prepared for those. All right. Let's go ahead and move on to our fourth threat. We're outlining this one as global turmoil. It's kind of an all-encompassing term. But if the last few years have taught us anything, it's certainly that anything can happen in this area. So from the pandemic to the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the eruption, of course, of a conflict now in the Middle East, the last few years have really felt like hit after hit of unprecedented challenges. For as many threats as we can track and even roughly predict, right, there are also many that we cannot. If not more that we cannot. A lot of things generally seem to come out of left field these days. And at the end of the day, businesses really have to prepare both for the known, which is sometimes easier, of course, but also for things that could be unknown and things that we need to just continue to work our brains around. So when we think about current conflicts, we are, of course, still paying very close attention to the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, really waging with no end in sight. I think we're almost to the 2-year mark. The potential economic risks of inflation and energy prices have really continued to be woven throughout this conflict. And I know many businesses, governments, and organizations are continuing to keep that in focus. The conflict between Israel and Hamas and really the escalated tensions that we're now seeing across the entirety of the Middle East and beyond, with really no end in sight again to Netanyahu recently indicating that a commitment will be had to persisting with things throughout the course of the year. So again, this feels like something that is very much around to stay and is highly volatile. And then the instability that continues to roil certain regions of Africa, the coup in Niger being the 7th on the continent in just a few years' time. These are a lot of the things that we're paying attention to as a global intelligence team, not just as individual incidents, but both as they're kind of woven together. These incidences raising both humanitarian concerns, but also concerns over global terrorism, as many organizations continue to thrive in these regions, and instability obviously having a lot of impacts there. And just as important as looking at things that are currently happening and being aware of those, it's also important to be aware of potential hotspots. There's many, we're only highlighting a few here, but many things for people to be continuously paying attention to that are happening around the world. First, the ongoing tensions, of course, between China and Taiwan. China continues to increase its military pressure around the island and presence around the islands, a lot of intimidation tactics being had there. And we, of course, just saw Taiwan elect its next president earlier this week, same party that has been in power for the last few cycles. And that party really focused on maintaining any and all independence from China. So a lot that's, still at play there. And then an escalation, or knowing that an escalation of any kind obviously brings a lot of uncertainty. As we look at what's happening between China and Taiwan, there are so many different woven pieces and parts as we look at the Western part of the globe, not only the United States, but Europe and all other countries that have reasonable implications here, right? There's a lot to continue to think about. And then even before the October 7th attack and the onset of things between Israel and Gaza, the world has been keeping a very close and persistent eye on the tensions between Iran and the US. At the root of previous tensions, of course, was Iran's nuclear program, but now much focus has really turned to Iran's training and support of its proxy forces. Not a day seems to go by where we're not really focused on that or seeing many headlines around that. At risk here, of course, not only security with this instability, but also economic implications. We're constantly looking at oil prices as well as the supply chain routes that are really being impacted in that area as well. So moving forward, really, no matter what unexpected global threats may emerge in 2024, you can initiate really foundational security efforts now so that your business is resilient enough to really navigate the year ahead and the years ahead. So a few tips here that we think are really worth considering. First, establishing a protocol for travel safety. If you have employees who are traveling in or near an area where a global conflict is already happening or could erupt, you obviously have the responsibility not only to bestow knowledge on them, but to protect them. So knowing ahead of time obviously is key. Also build a relationship with experts for additional counseling. Geopolitics can be incredibly complex. They can be incredibly layered. As I've mentioned, a lot of these things are really woven together. You're going to want to lean on trusted professionals, whether those are inside your organization or otherwise, to really provide you with updates on situations that may mean something to your organization, whether it's for the business or whether it's for your employees who may be traveling. And then lastly, use real-time threat intelligence to stay on top of global threats. I always say this: knowledge is power. Since a geopolitical crisis can really happen quickly and escalate in minutes, you're going to want to invest in a product or a team internally or externally that can really give you a peace of mind when it comes to having that situational awareness. That way you will have the most accurate information to protect not only your employees, but also your operations as well. All right, and that brings us to our final topic, which is digital disruption. So with recent advances in artificial intelligence and really the shift in social media platforms as well, finding and isolating reliable information, reliable intelligence is harder than ever. It presents a huge challenge for organizations with their ability to effectively mitigate risk and respond to emergencies. We're also seeing an unprecedented escalation of disinformation. This has been happening really rapidly over recent years and resulting in this signal to noise ratio that is really untenable for most people. So much information coming at them from different directions. Security analysts, business leaders, for this reason, are finding it a lot harder to find sources that they trust and to really distill information and understand for their employees and for their business what's reasonable, what's actionable, what's real for them to take into consideration. All right, so some more statistics that I think are really important to highlight here. First, a third of companies use generative AI regularly in at least one function. So we clearly know over the past year plus, adoption in the workplace is going up. We hear this from our customers all the time. I think we even hear this in our social circles. AI is definitely taking off. It's a topic of conversation all over the place. 40% of companies are saying that they're going to increase their investment in AI. So a growth and an adoption rate that's obviously high, all these numbers going up. And then as we see this growth, I think this is probably the most concerning thing, and hopefully something that everybody takes to heart and into consideration. Concerning to note that 90% of organizations don't have any policies or procedures to really mitigate risks of using AI, including accuracy, including cybersecurity. So I think if you think about that last one, it's really important to internalize that one. Do you know if your colleagues, your teams are using AI, and for what? And further, does your company have any policies to guide that usage and protect you, protect your team, and really protect the business? Unfortunately, one of the things that we're finding in this area is that more often than not, the answer to these questions is that no, there are no policies. And a lot of these conversations have not started within most organizations, or maybe happening in a silo and need to be exposed or expanded. And then separate but related, we've seen a significant increase in the number of real-time social media platforms over the past year, with the likes of Mastodon, Spoutable, Blue Sky. Meta's got their new Threads platform out. They launched that and it's gaining users. And this is in effect really decentralized, or I heard the term the other day, balkanized, these platforms and kind of real-time information gathering. So analysts and business security professionals are already spread thin. We know this from a lot of conversations with different organizations of all sizes. And this is really spreading them thinner, having to really focus more of their attention on more products to find information. So when we think about both artificial intelligence generated content and disinformation, misinformation propagated in these areas, combined with that decentralization of being able to find reliable intelligence and information in these areas, there's really a lot of instability, not only for these platforms, but for intelligence practitioners who are really trying to use these and collection techniques to find information real time to help expose things that are happening around different facilities, around your employees, and maybe even around your brand. So for many businesses, this may require turning to a threat intelligence solution or working internally to really find trustworthy sources of information. And while you and your teams can really focus on different areas, it can be really helpful to be able to lean on a team of professionals, obviously, that's conquering this area or considering trying to conquer this area as it comes to a lot of information and a lot of information flow. All right. So again, I want to make sure we bestow some sorts of proactive information into this environment, especially as it comes to digital disruption. As I mentioned in the previous slide, it's essential to keep humans involved in your threat monitoring to ensure accuracy and actionable information. We hear this from a lot of the folks that we support. We want to make sure that not only are we using artificial intelligence, but maybe there's a human in the loop that can really help to understand what's going on and really direct some of the efforts. This can help with some of the different practices internally. It's also important to educate your team on the risks of misinformation and how it can impact your business and workforce, right? Again, knowledge is power. And then also make sure to diversify your communication channels to share important information across your business. Many people these days are running around and have their cell phone, or they may be in different facilities or maybe different manufacturing plants. Really being able to communicate them across multiple channels is going to be essential. All right. I will go ahead and hand it back to Katie. I'll take a little bit of a breather and let you bestow on the audience a poll question.
Yes, this is a fantastic time for another poll. Thank you so much, Sara. So this time we'd like to know which of the 5 threats that we just covered will be the highest priority for you and your organization in 2024. I know it's hard to choose just one, but is your highest priority the climate change, cybersecurity incidents, activism and civil unrest, global turmoil, or maybe that digital disruption? So let's go ahead and give that just another couple of seconds here. I see some folks are still responding. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share these results. Okay, most people say cybersecurity incidents. That's not that big of a surprise to me. We're hearing about it all the time, as you mentioned, Sara, but what are your thoughts there?
I think it's definitely well-placed concern. Hopefully organizations are taking this seriously too and dedicating a good bit of time to preparing for this, maybe taking into consideration some of the things that we've mentioned. But I think it's unfortunate, but good to see, right? People are taking seriously pretty much the one thing that's a common theme for many organizations: cybersecurity, cyber threats.
Absolutely. Well, Sara, I hope that was a nice breather for you, because you are back up again. If you could just in a couple of minutes, give us some best practices for monitoring and communicating threats.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So, all right. Sticking with the theme of being proactive, when faced with these threats and trends, talking about communication, I think two big words are being transparent and being effective. So, of course, you're always going to want to let people know about emergencies and anything that could potentially impact their safety. But you can also have different departments within your organization own different communication strategies. There's a lot of content and information here. I'm not going to dive through all of this, but really what we're trying to distill here is that this can be a partnered plan, and multiple parts of organizations can really take responsibility for communications around different issues in different functions. This is something that I know will be supplied to those who are tuning in today. So something you can definitely internalize in the future. But bottom line, it's important to communicate at scale across your company so that everyone feels informed, prepared, and included. All right. So as we've mentioned a few times, weather can be a big thing. We know from the organizations that we support right now, it generally is kind of the tie that binds. I'll just note here, in a lot of these communication strategies, particularly with weather, taking this before and during and after approach can be really helpful as you distill things down. Before a storm, again, this is a scenario here, it can be a great time to proactively warn people about what you know, right? Do you have a specific forecast? Do you know where information is going to be coming from? Do you understand the impact? So a great time to really prepare yourself and prepare your workforce, your employees, folks across business continuity, so that they understand what's to come, and also to set an expectation at that point as to, hey, we're going to be communicating at these intervals in this place so people know where to go before there's any sort of chaos. During storms and incidents, it is great to alert people of any immediate impacts. Outages, of course, are really important in these situations, but it's also a great time that you can employ safety and security checks, help people understand that you're there and reaching out for them so that when the storm does pass, you can obviously deploy any resources. And then after a storm or after any incident, really being able to, again, survey your population, offer an all clear if things are gone or things are done. Maybe your offices have been impacted. A great time to be able to communicate to your employees kind of what the standards are, whether people can report to offices. And again, also a great way to extend duty of care beyond your office space or beyond your employees' population, understanding how people have maybe fared if they're in a home situation or if they can't work. So communication through each phase of an incident, a storm or otherwise, can really truly be key to keep your employees safe and connected, but also to keep business up and running. All right. Just a little bit about us. So solutions like AlertMedia offer a great way to have situational awareness to really understand what sorts of threats could impact your business and or your employees. Also, the ability to communicate quickly and efficiently with those in your ecosystem who are impacted or need to know, and even open up two-way communications, which are often important in an emergency, as I just noted, and to not only provide safety and support to your office workers, but also extending that to remote workers, anywhere workers, and travelers as well. So just a really good all-in-one platform and solution that can help in so many ways for different businesses and different employees. All right. I know we've shared a lot of information in this session, hopefully information that you and your teams find tremendously helpful as you plan ahead. But I also wanted to just summarize maybe some key aspects and key takeaways from today's presentation. So first, assess your risk profile, right? How it's different over the past 12 months, maybe how it's different over the past 24 months. We hear a lot of organizations that are downsizing a lot of their plans and conversations around the pandemic and increasing their conversations and preparedness around geopolitical turmoil. So really evaluating what you should be focused on, as well as evaluating your existing tools and processes to really make sure that you're leveraging best-in-class solutions to help support keeping your people safe and your businesses running smoothly. Also, always keep your focus on the employees. We talk to organizations about this a lot. It's obviously at the core to your success, whether it's giving information, receiving information, or just communication in general. Also, a bit of a given, but certainly not a bad reminder to conduct regular and comprehensive training so people know how to respond in an emergency and really to create that muscle memory. We hear from teams a lot when they can make these things kind of repetitive or rapid motions that people are very familiar with. It just makes it easier in an emergency when tensions are high and there's a lot at stake, a lot at risk. And then lastly, of course, let us know how we can help you. AlertMedia has a team of amazing intelligence professionals. I'm not just biased, they are wonderful. We've got a great customer support staff and really all at the end of the day focused on 24/7 help and support for our customers throughout an emergency. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it back to Katie for, I think, one more poll question.
Yes, that is the perfect segue into our last poll. This one's going to be quick, guys, because I want to have time for all your great questions that are coming in, as well as some additional resources to help you. So if you could just take a minute to let us know if you're interested in learning more about AlertMedia and how we can help with your preparedness and response efforts for the 2024 threat landscape. So you can say, yes, we'll happily get you some information, or you can say, no, not at this time, and that's fine too. So I'm going to give just a couple more seconds here, and then let's go ahead and move on to our questions. All right, Sarah, I'm going to put this one to you. In regards to risks related to business travel and returning to pre-pandemic levels, how do you think that historical data and trends will play into pre-travel planning and risk assessments? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super important in all situations to look back on any of the data that we can get our hands on, right? We spend a lot of time, even for presentations like this, looking at historic data as business travelers get back on the road, looking at that sort of data as far as it pertains to maybe an area that they're going, just kind of risks that could be associated with the kind of travel, I think can be incredibly important. It's just making sure that you're navigating, getting trustworthy information to really support using that to make judgments or justifications, and also potentially to just bestow information upon travelers.
Excellent. That's a great answer. Appreciate that. Now we have a bunch of questions coming in. Sarah, I'm going to stick with you here for another minute, just kind of about how you prepare for all of these threats at once, both from a business continuity perspective and, a physical security perspective, right? So do you recommend an all hazards approach to this type of preparedness, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think there are so many different things happening around the globe and around our businesses, right? Everybody's business can be particularly different. There's so many things that could impact you at any given point in time. I think, again, understanding the priorities for your business and the things that may threaten you the most, climate and natural disasters and weather is probably a major one. Cybersecurity, obviously a tie that binds. Everybody needs to be worried about those things. But what are the second, third, and fourth based on your business, your locations, your employee base, or maybe even your brand focus that you really need to be prepared for? I would just say in being able to prioritize those and more highly prioritize and maybe deprioritize others over time, it can really help organizations and business continuity risk resilient teams really establish what those are, dedicating more resources to those too, and then bringing in business partners. I know most organizations and teams kind of look for champions with different parts of the organization, but being able to truly look for champions within the parts of the organization that are going to help the most or be able to help the most if there is some sort of incident in one of those categories, I think that's a way to exponentially increase your team, maybe insights, expertise, and capabilities just when something happens.
That is an excellent answer, because we got another question that's similar coming in here about those types of partnerships. So, Sarah, do you have any additional thoughts about interagency or interorganizational communication resources for things like information sharing between security professionals or safety professionals to coordinate planning, response, recovery? I don't know if you have specific entities in mind, or if you could just sort of speak to the importance a bit more of those partnerships.
Yeah, I think just in general, that partnership approach is going to be really important. And I would flip this on its head a little bit, because I think the partnerships internally are table stakes, right? When you think about some sort of disaster or some sort of impact to your organization that's going to cause some sort of emergency or downtime for your business, it's table stakes to be able to have those partnerships internally. I think there's a lot of different ways to build those out depending on the organization and the culture. Some things can be easier than others, but I also think it's incredibly important to have external partnerships. We talk to a lot of organizations that are having successes, not only with things like local law enforcement, but also with other local businesses, businesses that might be similar or dissimilar. But partnering with other security practitioners or business continuity practitioners to understand how they can support each other, either with information sharing and knowledge bases, or also with understanding how they might be doing things internally that can really help. I think those are some key things that I've heard from different businesses that I think can really be helpful in supporting. And then I think, again, I think from it sounds like maybe the approach of basically housing information, probably using one centralized platform or location. I know our platform platform has centralized areas that people can talk about different incidences that are happening. I think centralizing something into a way that everybody can share information can be really important too, obviously.
Thanks, Sarah. Jason, I got one for you. Since we are seeing an influx of major rain events, why aren't we seeing more snow and ice major events?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, the one thing I will say is that when conditions are favorable for snow, you can still have high severity snow events. And for example, when we saw the series of atmospheric rivers along the West Coast last year, those were some record-setting snows across the Sierra Nevada mountains, and so on and so forth. The one thing I will say is that in a year like this, where maybe not the entire winter is below normal, you're still going to have at least these 1 to 2 week periods where you can get a significant snowfall. And I know that interest along the I-95 corridor and along the Northeast U.S. may be kind of lulled to sleep by these last 2 years where they haven't really had much in the way of wintry precipitation. But really, all it takes is one blockbuster nor'easter, and that could really make up the difference for an entire year. You can get a quick 24, 36-inch snow event. There's a lot of precipitable water. In fact, a lot of times along the east coast of the U.S., when we have above normal water temperatures, that's actually fueling these storms. So when you get those occasional periods where the air temperature is below 32 or freezing, you will get more significant snow events.
Thanks, Jason. And I actually have a comment here on your extreme heat slides that I just wanted to share. One of our audience members says they see an increase in respiratory or exacerbated existing medical issues in heat events. So I think that's, you hit on that a little bit, Jason, but I think that's such a great point to share. So thank you, Patrick, for that. And then we have time for one final question. So Sarah, a couple of folks, or many folks actually might have smaller teams or smaller budgets when it comes to this type of thing. So if they're going to try to do some like in-house threat intelligence, like what sites or sources do you think they could just start with?
Yeah, sure. I mean, from an information perspective, right, we see a lot of information on social media platforms, depending on the area of the globe that you're most interested in. Different platforms are used in different ways. I mentioned the decentralization, of the platforms. That's definitely made it harder for smaller teams or just teams in general, because there is a abundance of noise in just a lot of places to get it. Media can be really great, right? Tapping into local media, national media, international, even state run to some degree. Our team leverages it. We obviously look at it through a much different lens, but looking at different media outlets and being able to aggregate their content and information, it can oftentimes be a bit slower than finding it in other places, but it can be a bit more reliable depending on focuses. And then I would just say basically tapping into anything that you can from an authoritative perspective. Anytime we can get anything from a government entity that's going to send out information, law enforcement sources, fire brigades, things of that nature, those are the things that I would look for and look at. That are going to give you obviously the most credible information. Again, the timing can be potentially slower, but I would definitely probably solicit those as maybe your first targets. And again, partnering with companies like ours, there's a lot of folks that really try and, exponentially increase the size of somebody's smaller team to help with information flow.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And guys, I apologize we couldn't get to more questions. You guys are asking great ones, so we really appreciate your engagement. But I'm going to give you some contact info for, I almost said Sason and Jera. Sarah and Jason, so that you can get in touch with them. So I do have some additional resources I wanted to share with you guys. Today was just a brief summary of the top threats and trends that we're looking at for 2024, but we have a full 2024 threat outlook report at alertmedia.com, as well as some other great resources here on communication, a safety calendar. I really think you'll find it beneficial. And as I mentioned, if you do want to keep the conversation going with Sarah or Jason, they are both on LinkedIn. So they're under their full names there if you want to just reach out and ask a question or say hello. And Jason and Sarah, I just want to thank you both today. Sarah, I really appreciate all of your expertise, and that was a huge chunk of information. So thank you.
Absolutely happy to share. And as Katie mentioned, always happy for people to reach out, happy to entertain different questions or help collaborate on things with your organizations.
Thank you. And Jason, we really appreciate you. It's so great hearing from a meteorologist on all things severe weather and climate. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to follow up.
All right, that concludes our presentation today. We really appreciate you spending some time with us and hope to see you on a future AlertMedia webinar. Of course, I want to thank Security Magazine and that team for hosting us today and being such a wonderful partner.